The funeral wasn't even over before they started dividing up her life. Maggie Holloway had been married to Bobby for 30 years. 30 years of cooking his meals, keeping his house, folding herself small enough to fit inside a life that, as it turned out, had never legally been hers. And on the afternoon they buried him, while the dirt on his grave was still dark and fresh, his sister Darlene walked into the kitchen with a legal folder and a smile and informed Maggie, in the gentlest possible voice, that she had 30 days to leave. Maggie did not cry. She had learned a long time ago, 20 years in the army will do that. That some rooms you don't show your pain in. She stood there holding the one thing she'd managed to take from Bobby's room before Darlene arrived. His old Bible. Brown leather, worn at the corners. For 30 years he'd kept it on his nightstand. For 30 years he'd never once let her touch it. But that last morning, before they took him, he'd pressed it into her hands. She could feel something folded inside the pages. She didn't know yet what it was. She would. Bobby Holloway was buried on a Tuesday in October, and the earth they turned over him was darker than Maggie expected, almost black, like river soil after a long rain. She had walked 92 steps from the church door back to the house. She knew because she counted them. She didn't know why she counted. She just needed something to do with her mind that wasn't falling apart. The church bell had gone quiet by the time she reached the front porch. The smell of the turned earth was still with her. That particular smell of Tennessee ground in autumn, deep and cold and final. She stood at the door for a moment before going in, one hand on the frame, the Bible pressed against her chest. 30 years. She had cooked in that kitchen every morning for 30 years. She knew which floorboard creaked and which fuse to check before calling anyone. She had kept this place running, quietly, without credit. There had been a baby, early in the marriage, 4th month. They never talked about it afterward. Not once, not ever. Bobby hadn't known how, and Maggie had learned not to need him to. She had folded that grief up small and put it somewhere she didn't have to look at every day. It was the first thing she learned to carry alone in that house. It was not the last. The name on the deed had never been hers. She had learned, somewhere along the way, to need very little, because needing things in that house had always come with a price she paid alone. They came into the kitchen less than 2 hours after the coffin went into the ground. Darlene first. Bobby's oldest sister, 65 years old, navy blazer, hair set like she'd had it done that morning. She probably had. She was carrying a manila folder the way a person carries something they've been planning to carry for a long time. Patrice came in behind her, quieter, her eyes already moving around the room. June stood in the doorway and looked at the floor. Maggie. Darlene set the folder on the kitchen table and pulled out a chair, not to sit in, just to make the gesture of settling in. We need to talk about the house. Maggie was standing at the counter. She had not offered them coffee. Before Darlene could open the folder, Maggie spoke. Her voice was flat. No edge to it, no tremble. The same voice she had used in field stations when a soldier came in and the situation was bad and there was no time for anyone to panic. Which notary office processed those documents, Maggie said, and on what date? Darlene blinked, just once. A small hesitation, the kind that lasts less than a second but says everything. Then she answered. Maggie nodded slowly. She didn't write anything down. She didn't need to. She filed it somewhere behind her eyes and let her face stay still. She did not look at the folder again. Darlene laid it open on the table anyway. A photocopy of a will. Bobby's name at the top, the language formal and final. All assets to the Holloway family. Darlene named as executor. A line at the bottom where Bobby had signed, or where someone had signed for him. Maggie's name did not appear anywhere in the document. Darlene explained it with the patience of someone who has rehearsed being patient. The house would need to be assessed. The accounts would be frozen pending probate. Maggie would of course be given time. 30 days was more than fair, Darlene said, given the circumstances. Given the circumstances. Maggie stood at the counter and listened to all of it without moving. She was holding the Bible with both hands now, and without meaning to, she was holding it tighter than she had been a moment before. That kitchen table. She had stood at it for 30 years, rolled pie crusts on it, sat at it alone on nights Bobby was away. She had never once sat at the head of it. Darlene set the folder down on it like a period at the end of a sentence. Across the room, June glanced up. It lasted less than a second. Her eyes moving to Maggie's face, then away, dropping back to the floor. Quick and private, like something she hadn't meant to do. Maggie noticed. She noticed the way she had always noticed things in that house. Quietly, without reacting, filing it away. June would not look at her directly again. Not until the courthouse steps. When Darlene and Patrice finally left, full of promises about paperwork and timelines, all delivered in that careful, considerate tone, Maggie stood alone in the kitchen. The house was very quiet. She looked down at the Bible in her hands. The worn brown cover, the corners soft with years of handling. Bobby's name pressed into the lower right corner, Robert James Holloway, in letters that had faded to almost nothing. For 30 years, this book had sat on his nightstand, like it belonged to a world she had no part in. He had never once handed it to her. But that last morning, he had pressed it into her hands without a word. Just the weight of it, and his eyes, and then the nurses coming in. She turned it over slowly. She could feel near the back a small fold of paper. She hadn't opened it yet. Not yet. Maggie did not turn on the lights that first night. Not because she was grieving. She had grieved before, in field stations, in hospital corridors, in a car pulled over because she needed 30 seconds. This was different. Maggie needed dark. She sat at the kitchen table and let the house settle around her. Outside, the river was running. She could hear it faintly through the old window frame, that low, steady sound that had been there every night for 30 years, underneath everything else, whether she noticed it or not. She had 30 days. 30 days. She had packed field hospitals in less than 12 hours. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that she had nowhere to go. She reached for the Bible. She reached for the Bible. The folder Darlene had left was on the counter. The only thing in the room that felt like it might have an answer was the worn brown book with Bobby's name on the cover. She opened it. The smell that came up was faint. Old paper. Something like cedar. She turned to the back pages slowly. Bobby's handwriting was there. On the last page, in the margin, running down the side, the same unsteady lean she had seen on grocery lists and birthday cards for 30 years, except smaller. More careful. Like he had been trying not to use too much space. She leaned closer. Her phone screen died. The flashlight she'd been using. The battery had been low since the funeral. She hadn't thought to charge it. Went dark, and the kitchen went with it. She sat for a moment in the complete black, one hand still on the open page. She had seen something. Bobby's handwriting, and below it, a verse underlined in red ink. the red so dark it was almost brown now, old ink, not recent, and between the pages, near the back, a small fold of paper tucked in like a bookmark. She hadn't reached it yet. A knock at the door. 3 knocks, actually. Firm, evenly spaced. Not timid. Not the knock of someone delivering bad news or asking forgiveness. The knock of someone who had decided to come and was not second-guessing it. Maggie opened the door. The woman on the porch was younger than her by maybe 15 years. Dark jacket with dried mud along the hem. A gas station coffee cup in one hand. The other hand already in her pocket, like she'd been rehearsing what to say on the drive over. "Mrs. Holloway, my name is Joanne Pickett. I'm an attorney." A short pause. "Mrs. Miller called me. She was at the funeral today. She thought you might need someone to talk to who wasn't family." Maggie looked at her for a moment. "Come in," she said. Joanne sat across the kitchen table and read through Darlene's documents without speaking, slowly, line by line. While she read, her eyes moved once to the doorway, to Maggie's jacket hanging on the hook by the door. The old army patch on the left shoulder, the rod and serpent of the medical corps, faded to almost nothing. She looked at it for just a second, then back at the documents. When she finished, she set the papers down and was quiet for a moment. "The signature date is 14 months before Mr. Holloway's final hospitalization," she said. "But the ink on the signature line doesn't match the rest of the document. The distribution is wrong, too even, too controlled. This isn't the original. Someone made a clean copy and signed it." She paused. "I need time to verify this properly, but I need you to promise me something first. Don't sign anything Darlene gives you. Not one page, not even something that looks routine." Maggie nodded. Then Joanne said, "Can I ask you something that isn't about the will?" She had been 8 years old. There was a flu outbreak moving through this part of Tennessee, bad enough that the civilian clinic in Heron's Bend couldn't keep up, and the National Guard had set up a temporary medical station in the old Grange Hall on Route 7. Her father was a sergeant rotating through from Fort Campbell, and he'd brought her in at 7 in the evening with a fever of 104. The nurse on duty had finished her shift at 6. She stayed anyway. Joanne didn't remember much about that night in any orderly way. She remembered the smell of the hall and the cold cloth on her forehead, and a voice that kept saying, "Stay with me, you're doing fine," in the same even tone whether things were going fine or not. The kind of voice that made you believe it simply because it didn't waver. She didn't learn the nurse's name until she was 19. She'd thought to ask her father one afternoon, and he'd looked at her like the question surprised him. "Maggie," he'd said, "she was the kind of person who stays." Joanne looked across the table. "I became a lawyer in this county," she said, "and I stayed. I always figured I'd know why eventually." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Maggie did not remember that child. 36 years and hundreds of patients and one flu season in a drafty Grange Hall. She did not remember the girl with the high fever, or the sergeant father, or the particular night. But that child had remembered her. She looked down at her hands on the table. They were steady. They were always steady. That was the army in her. The hands stayed steady even when everything else didn't. "Thank you," she said. Joanne left just before 11. She wrote her number on a paper napkin from her jacket pocket. Not her business card, just the napkin, like she understood that a card would have felt like a transaction. "Call me in the morning," she said at the door. "We'll figure out what we're dealing with." After she left, Maggie stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then she went to the table, found her phone charger in her purse, plugged it into the wall outlet by the stove, and waited 2 minutes for enough battery to come back. She picked up the Bible. She found the page. This time she turned on the light. The clock above the kitchen stove read 12:15 when Maggie turned to the last page of the Bible. The overhead light was on for the first time all evening. Bobby's handwriting was in the margin of the last page. She almost missed it. It was smaller than she expected, tucked along the inner edge like he hadn't wanted to take up too much room. The letters leaned slightly to the right and trembled at the ends of certain strokes. She had seen that trembling before, in the last year, when he signed his name to insurance forms and his hand wouldn't quite do what he asked of it. He had not started with "my love." He had not started with "I'm sorry." He had started with "Maggie, I know I have no right to ask you to keep reading." She stopped. The kitchen was very still. 30 years, and that was the first true thing Bobby had ever said to her. She kept reading. He wrote the way he had always talked, in short runs, stopping and starting. He did not make excuses. She had expected them. They didn't come. He wrote that he had watched his family treat her badly for 30 years, and he had said nothing. Not once. Not in 30 years of dinners where Darlene talked over her, or Christmases where Vera handed out gifts with Maggie's name absent from half the tags, or the quiet, steady pressure of being made to feel like a guest in a house she kept running with her own hands. He wrote that he had been afraid. Afraid of his mother, afraid of Darlene, afraid of the particular loneliness of being cut off from the family he had grown up inside of. He knew that was not an excuse. He wrote it like a man reading charges against himself. "I couldn't fix what I was while I was alive," he wrote, "but I could fix what happened after." 6 years ago, the winter after his first cardiac diagnosis, after the cardiologist in Knoxville had used words like progressive and management and realistic expectations, Bobby had driven alone to Nashville. 200 miles. He had told Maggie he was visiting an old army buddy. She had packed him a sandwich and a thermos of coffee and watched him back out of the driveway. He had driven alone to Nashville, found a law firm from a directory. He established a trust, not in his name, filed quietly, no connection to the Holloways. Into it he placed the house, the savings account, a fund he had built from side work over 20 years. All of it going to Margaret Ellen Holloway when he died, outside the reach of Darlene. He had told no one in Heron's Bend. "I knew what Darlene would do," he wrote. "I knew what Mama would let her do. I was a coward for 30 years, Maggie. I can't take that back. But I could make sure it didn't follow you after I was gone." She set the letter down for a moment. Outside, the river moved. She could hear it through the window. That same low sound, the same it had been every night, unchanged. 30 years he had said nothing. 30 years she had ironed his shirts and kept his house and carried what he couldn't carry and asked for nothing, because asking had never been worth the cost. 30 years. And he had spent 6 of them quietly building her a door out. She picked the letter back up. Near the end, he had written less. The handwriting got smaller, more careful, like the effort of it was reaching its limit. He had marked a passage, not with a note, not with any explanation. Just a line drawn in red ink beneath a verse near the middle of the book. The ink so old now it had gone almost brown at the edges, but still visible, still deliberate. Between the marked page and the back cover, folded twice and fitted in like it had always lived there, was a small piece of paper. She unfolded it. The name of a law firm in Nashville, a trust account number, a contact name, Mr. Gerald Holt, Esquire. That was all. 4 words told her everything. The trust was real. She sat with that for a long moment. Then she turned back to the marked passage, Psalm 46. The verse Bobby had underlined. God is within her, she will not fall. No date written beside it. No explanation of why he had chosen it, or when, or what he had been thinking when he drew that line in red ink. He hadn't needed to write any of that down. She understood it without him. Bobby Holloway had never once said "I love you" in a way that cost him anything. But he had underlined a sentence in a book he had carried for 50 years, and he had pressed that book into her hands on the last morning of his life. She sat for a long time, not crying, not moving, just sitting. She folded the paper back along its crease and placed it in her cardigan pocket, against her chest. She picked up her phone. She called Joanne. Outside, the river kept moving, the way it had moved for 30 years, without asking, without judging, only remembering. Joanne called on Tuesday morning, her voice carrying the particular steadiness of someone who has practiced delivering bad news without letting it land like a stone. The trust was valid. Established 6 years ago under a property management LLC, documents held by a firm in Nashville, sole beneficiary listed as Margaret Ellen Holloway. Every asset Bobby had placed inside it, the house, the savings account, the fund he had built quietly over 20 years, was outside the reach of any will Darlene could produce. Maggie stood at the kitchen window and listened. Outside, the river was doing what it always did. "There's something else," Joanne said. She paused just long enough for Maggie to understand that the pause meant something. Darlene filed a petition with the county court this morning. Her attorney is arguing the trust was invalid, that Bobby lacked the mental capacity to establish it. Maggie said nothing. They've located a Dr. Gerald Pruitt. He was Bobby's physician 11 years ago, before Bobby changed doctors. Pruitt has signed a written declaration stating that Bobby showed early signs of cognitive decline during appointments approximately 10 years ago. Maggie understood immediately what the timeline was designed to do. "It's a thin argument," Joanne said, "but thin arguments win when the judge is new and the paperwork looks clean." After she hung up, Maggie stood at the window. She thought about Bobby driving alone to Nashville. The sandwich she had packed him without knowing where he was really going. He had done everything right. And they were going to try to use the last years of his life to undo it. The rumor started the following week. She found out the way you find out things in Heron's Bend. Not because anyone said it to her face, but because of the way Mrs. Garvey at the pharmacy had suddenly found something very interesting to look at on the shelf behind the counter when Maggie walked in. The way the conversation at the post office stopped a half beat too early. Small adjustments, the kind people make without deciding to. By the time it reached the back pew of the church on Sunday, she already knew. The content was simple. Maggie Holloway had maintained a close friendship with another man during the years Bobby was ill. No name. There was never a name. Names could be challenged. A nameless rumor in a small town is almost impossible to disprove because there is nothing specific enough to deny. She heard it for the first time on a Monday afternoon at the grocery on Millbrook Road. She was third in line, a basket over one arm. Milk, bread, a can of soup. The ordinary mathematics of a life being lived one day at a time. The 2 women ahead of her were talking, their voices at a normal register, easy and unhurried. Then Maggie stepped forward. The voices dropped. Half a register, maybe less. The kind of adjustment people make without deciding to make it. The grocery bag handle cut into her palm. She shifted it to the other hand. The floor cleaner they used in that store had a particular sharp chemical smell. She had never noticed it before, not in 30 years of shopping there. She noticed it now. Mrs. Reeves and Mrs. Cutter did not turn around. They stopped talking. Maggie set her items on the belt. The cashier, a young woman who had graduated 2 years ago from the same high school Darlene's kids had attended, rang them through without meeting her eyes. Maggie's face did not change. She had learned that in the army, too. There were situations where the most important thing you could do was give nothing away. Keep the face still, keep the hands moving, get through the immediate moment and deal with the rest later, somewhere private, somewhere the damage didn't have witnesses. She paid. She took her bag. She walked out into the October air and stood beside her car for a moment before getting in. Inside the store, she could see through the window the two women had resumed their conversation. She walked the river road the next morning, the way she had walked it every morning for 30 years. Calvin Mercer was on his front porch when she passed. He was watering the planters along the railing, ceramic pots, late-season mums going brown at the edges, the kind of task a person does on a cool morning when they need something to do with their hands. He looked up when she passed. She did not nod. He did not nod. They had not spoken since 2009. Not a word, not a wave, not the small acknowledgments that neighbors exchange without thinking. 15 years of a silence that both of them had maintained without ever formally deciding to. In 2009, a contractor named Harold Fitch had lost his professional license in a county civil proceeding. Calvin had been in the adjacent courtroom that week and heard enough of Bobby Holloway's testimony to form a belief. Not a fact, a belief. The kind a man carries for 15 years without examining too closely. Harold Fitch had lost his license. Calvin had watched it happen and said nothing. He had thought about it more times than he would admit to anyone. He watched Maggie walk past now, her back straight, her pace the same it always was, giving nothing to the road or the morning or the man on the porch watching her go. He set down the watering can. He went inside. 3 nights ago, he knew the date because he'd checked the timestamp twice. His security camera had been running. He'd had it installed last spring after his neighbor's bicycle was taken from the driveway. The camera faced the public road, angled to capture vehicles coming and going. It was a simple setup, the kind sold at any hardware store, motion activated, storing footage to a card in 7-day loops. He hadn't thought much about it since installation. It had become part of the house the way smoke detectors become part of a house. He pulled up the footage from 3 nights ago, 11:14 p.m. A car parked on the public road in front of the Holloway house. A man in a gray suit, the kind of suit a county attorney wears to present a professional impression without spending too much on it, standing beside the passenger door. Darlene Holloway facing him. The attorney passed her a document. She signed it. They shook hands. Then the attorney walked to the back of the car and opened the rear passenger door. He handed an envelope to someone sitting inside. The camera angle showed the person from the shoulders down. White medical coat. The envelope was thick, the kind of thickness that comes from paper, or from something more substantial than paper. Calvin watched it twice. He paused on the frame with the white coat. He had retired 6 years ago. He had promised himself he was done with courtrooms. But he had sat on that bench for 18 years, and he knew exactly what he was looking at. Evidence tampering. On a public street. 11:14 at night. He did not pick up the phone. Not that night. He turned off the screen and sat in the dark, thinking about Harold Fitch and whether his own silence back then had cost more than he'd ever let himself calculate. 18 years on the bench. Calvin knew what evidence tampering looked like. He had just watched it happen on his own street. Calvin Mercer did not call ahead. He had never been the kind of man who called ahead. 18 years on the bench will do that. You show up when you're ready, say what needs saying, and leave. Joanne's office was on the second floor of a converted building on Clement Street, above a tax preparation service that was closed until February. Calvin was sitting on the front step when she arrived at 7:40 in the morning, a USB drive in his hand. His jacket buttoned against the October cold. He did not stand when she approached. He held out the drive. "I'm not here in any official capacity," he said, when she had sat down across from him on the step. "I'm a private citizen. I have a security camera that faces the public road in front of my property. 3 nights before Dr. Pruitt's written declaration was dated, that camera recorded Darlene Holloway and her attorney on that road at 11:14 p.m. Her attorney handed an envelope to a third party in the back seat of the car. The third party was wearing a white medical coat. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a folded printout. That's Pruitt's public disciplinary record from the Tennessee Department of Health. There was an ethics complaint filed against him 8 years ago. It was dismissed, but it's on record. Any attorney worth her license can use that to establish a pattern of credibility issues." Joanne took the printout. She read it without speaking. Calvin waited. He had always been good at waiting. "I'm not a judge anymore," he said. "I'm a neighbor with a camera and a retirement that's given me too much time to read public records. You do what you think is right with it." He stood. He straightened his jacket, both hands, working from the bottom button up, the kind of gesture a man makes when he is finishing one thing before starting another. Then he said the thing he had not planned to say. "I'm not doing this for Maggie Holloway," he said. "I'm doing it because Harold Fitch lost something in this county that he shouldn't have lost. And I've been telling myself for 15 years that it wasn't my fault. Maybe it wasn't. But I'm done using that as a reason to look the other way." He left without waiting for a response. Joanne sat on the step for a moment after he was gone, the USB drive in one hand and the printout in the other, listening to his car pull away from the curb. Calvin had been telling himself for 15 years that Harold Fitch wasn't his fault. This morning, he stopped. 3 months after Darlene filed her petition, the hearing convened in Courtroom 2 of the Herons Bend County Courthouse. It was a small room. Dark wood paneling, fluorescent lights, the smell of old paper and floor wax. The gallery was nearly full. Darlene sat at the plaintiff's table in a navy blazer, hair set, hands folded on the surface in front of her. She had the posture of a woman who had been certain of the outcome for 3 months and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Her attorney presented the case methodically. Pruitt's declaration, the timeline, a witness, the undue influence argument. Across the room, Maggie sat at the respondent's table. She placed her hands flat on the table, both palms down, the way she had in field stations when there was nothing to do yet but stay present. She listened to Greer describe her marriage, her life from the outside, accurate in the details, wrong in the way that mattered. Her face did not change. Darlene's third witness was a man named Terrence Booth, a former neighbor who had lived 2 houses down on the River Road until he moved to Chattanooga 4 years ago. Booth testified that on several occasions during the period when Bobby was hospitalized, he had observed an unfamiliar vehicle, a dark-colored pickup, he said, parked in the Holloway driveway for extended periods of time. He could not identify the driver. He had not thought much of it at the time, he said. He was mentioning it now because he had been asked. Joanne cross-examined him for 11 minutes. The witness's account was thin, but the judge, a man named Hartwell, appointed 8 months ago, replacing a judge who had retired after 22 years, was listening with an expression that Joanne recognized. Not convinced, not dismissive, uncertain in the specific way of someone who is looking for a reason to decide and hasn't found one yet. He called a 15-minute recess. Joanne and Maggie stood in the courthouse hallway. The hallway smelled of the same floor wax as the courtroom, and the fluorescent light above them had a flicker in it that no one had gotten around to fixing. Down the hall, Darlene and Greer were conferring in low voices near the water fountain. "He's leaning their direction," Joanne said. She did not soften it. Maggie had not asked her to soften things, not once in 3 months, and she wasn't going to start now. Booth's testimony was thin, but it planted something. Hartwell is new enough that he doesn't want to rule against a family and get it wrong. I need something that speaks directly to Pruitt's credibility. Something that makes the declaration itself the problem, not just the argument around it. Maggie was quiet for a moment. The fluorescent light flickered. "You have it," she said. "Use what Calvin gave you." Back in the courtroom, Joanne requested permission to introduce supplementary evidence. She submitted the security camera footage, authenticated by a signed statement from Calvin Mercer, attesting that the camera was installed on his property facing the public road, that the footage had not been altered, and that he was prepared to testify in person if the court required it. She submitted the footage timestamp, 3 nights before Dr. Pruitt's declaration was dated. She submitted the relevant segment: the gray suit, the document, the handshake, the thick envelope passed to a figure in a white medical coat. Then she submitted Dr. Pruitt's disciplinary record from the Tennessee Department of Health. Greer objected. Twice. Both objections were overruled. The name Calvin Mercer was in the signed statement, and Judge Hartwell read it twice before he set it down. Calvin was not in the room. He had sent a USB drive and 2 pieces of paper and gone home to water his planters. But 18 years on the county bench leaves something. Judge Hartwell read the signed statement twice. He watched the footage. He reviewed the Pruitt record. The room was very quiet. Joanne set her pen on the table. Greer sat with his hands folded, saying nothing. Darlene looked at the screen. Her hands shifted. One moved to cover the other. A small adjustment. Nobody said anything about it. Greer requested a continuance. Judge Hartwell denied it. In the gallery, June Holloway's seat had been empty since the hearing began. It was still empty. Nobody mentioned it. Nobody needed to. The ruling came 40 minutes later. Hartwell read it without preamble. The trust was valid. The petition was denied. All assets passed to Margaret Ellen Holloway. Maggie sat still while he read. She did not move when he finished. Joanne put a hand briefly on her arm. Not a squeeze, just a placement. The way you touch someone when words would be too much. Darlene stood and gathered her things without looking at Maggie. At the door, she stopped. For one moment, she stood with her hand on the frame. Then she walked out. Darlene Holloway left the courthouse without looking back, walking fast and straight, the walk of a person trying to get ahead of something that is already behind them. The judge read the ruling at 11 in the morning, his voice carrying the same flat tone he might use to read a grocery receipt. 30 years of a life. The resolution of it took 4 sentences. Patrice wept somewhere behind Maggie. A soft, uncertain sound, the kind of crying that doesn't quite know what it's for. Darlene said nothing. She gathered her documents into her folder with the careful efficiency of a woman who had already decided, before the ruling was finished, that she would not give the room anything to remember her by. June's seat in the gallery was still empty. Joanne placed her hand briefly on Maggie's shoulder. "It's done," she said. Maggie looked at the front of the room for a moment, at the bench where Hartwell was already gathering his own papers, at the Tennessee state flag in the corner, slightly crooked on its stand. "Not quite," she said. Joanne waited for an explanation. None came. Maggie was the last person to leave the courtroom. She put on her coat slowly, one arm at a time. Outside, the October air was sharp and smelled of the river. She drove home alone. The envelope was on the front porch step when she got there. She almost missed it. It was set against the riser of the step rather than laid flat, and in the late afternoon shadow it was nearly the same color as the wood. She would have stepped over it if she hadn't been looking down. No stamp, no return address, no postmark of any kind, just a name on the front, written in blue ink that had gone slightly watery at the edges, the way handwriting goes when the hand holding the pen is not entirely steady. Margaret. Maggie stood on the path for a moment with the envelope in her hand. She had seen that handwriting for 30 years. It appeared every December on the Christmas cards that Vera sent to the family, cards addressed to Bobby and the family, or simply to the Holloways, the kind of address that included everyone and no one in particular. Maggie's name had never appeared on the front of anything Vera had mailed. Until today. She went inside. She set her purse on the counter. She put the kettle on. Not because she wanted tea, but because having something on the stove gave the kitchen a sense of ordinary purpose, and she needed that right now. Then she sat at the table and opened the envelope. Vera did not begin with Dear Margaret or Dear Maggie. She began with nothing, just the words, in the unsteady cursive of a woman who had been writing letters her entire life. She wrote that she knew about the trust. Bobby had told her 3 years before he died. It was a Tuesday afternoon in September, she wrote. She remembered because she had been shelling butter beans on the back porch when he came and sat down beside her, which was something he almost never did in those last years. He sat with her for a while without speaking. Then he told her he was afraid of what would happen to Maggie after he was gone. He told her what he had done about it. Vera had not told Darlene. She had kept that secret for 3 years. Through Bobby's decline, through the funeral, through the week after when Darlene began making her calls. When Darlene told her about Dr. Pruitt, about what she intended to use him for, Vera had said nothing. She wrote that plainly. No softening, no suggestion that she hadn't fully understood. She had known what Pruitt's declaration was meant to do. She had known it was wrong. She had said nothing because she was 83 years old and Bobby was gone and Darlene was what she had left, and the thought of standing against her own daughter, of losing her, was a fear she had chosen over doing what was right. I have made that choice before, she wrote. Many times, over many years. I made it every time someone in this family said something unkind to you and I did not speak. I told myself it was not my place. It was always my place. I simply chose not to take it. Maggie set the page down for a moment. The kettle had begun to hiss on the stove. She didn't get up. Outside, the river moved. Same sound it always made. Same river. She picked the letter back up. The final paragraph was shorter than the others. The handwriting there was smaller, more compressed, as if Vera had been aware of how much room she had left on the page and had tried to fit what remained into it carefully. I am not writing this to be forgiven, she wrote. I know better than to ask for that. I am writing it because Bobby deserved to have someone in this family tell the truth about what he tried to do for you, and because you deserve to know that at least one person in this house understood what was being done to you and chose silence anyway. I am sorry for what that cost you. I don't expect that to mean very much, But I needed you to know it was a choice. Maggie read that last sentence twice. I needed you to know it was a choice. That was the most honest sentence Vera Holloway had spoken in 83 years. It arrived 30 years too late. It arrived nonetheless. She folded the letter back along its original creases. 4 folds, the way it had come out of the envelope, each crease already set from however long Vera had taken to decide whether to send it. She opened the Bible to Psalm 46. Bobby's paper was still there, where she had placed it the night she read his letter. The Nashville law firm, the trust account number, his handwriting on the final page of the book he had carried for 50 years. She placed Vera's letter beside it. 2 pieces of paper, 2 people. She closed the Bible. She did not go to the desk for paper. She did not pick up her phone. She was not ready to write back. And she was not certain she was wrong to feel that way. Some things deserved more than an evening to decide. She turned off the kitchen light. The river was still running outside. Maggie placed the letter in the Bible, turned off the light, and sat long enough in the dark to understand that some questions do not need to be answered tonight. Maggie was awake at 5. The Army's old insistence, the one thing that had stayed hers through everything. She made coffee the way she always made it, measured, unhurried. She carried her cup to the kitchen table, and she sat down. Not at the side where she had always sat. She sat at the head of the table, Bobby's chair. She had never sat in it while he was alive. Not once. Not because anyone had said she couldn't. It simply hadn't occurred to her. She set her cup down on the table in front of her. The coffee was hot. The window faced the river. She sat there for a while, just that. Calvin came down the river road at 5:30, the way he came every morning. Coat buttoned, hands in his pockets. The measured pace of a man who walks not for exercise but for the particular quality of thinking that only happens when the feet are moving and the world is still mostly quiet. He glanced toward the kitchen window as he passed. Maggie nodded. Calvin nodded. He kept walking. No words. None were needed. She reached for the Bible. It had been on the table since last night, closed, the worn brown cover catching the early light coming through the window. She opened it to Psalm 46. The page came easily, the spine already broken at that point from how many times it had been opened there in recent weeks. The 2 papers were still inside. Bobby's, on the left, the Nashville firm, the account number, his unsteady handwriting running down the margin of the final page. Vera's, on the right. 4 folds, blue ink gone slightly watery at the edges, the handwriting of a woman who had taken a long time to decide. She read the underlined verse. God is within her. She will not fall. She didn't know when Bobby had drawn that line in red ink. She didn't know what he had been thinking, or whether he had believed it about her at the time, or whether he had been trying to make himself believe it, or both. She would never know. That was one of the things death closes off. The chance to ask the question you didn't think to ask until it was too late. But she knew what she believed, sitting in this chair on this morning. Bobby had written that verse for her. This morning, for the first time, she read it for herself. She closed the Bible and held it in both hands for a moment. The worn cover, the corners soft with 50 years of handling, his name pressed into the lower right in letters that had faded almost to nothing. Then she set it on the table and looked out the window at the river. She had looked at that river from this window for 30 years. This morning she looked at it from the head of the table. It looked the same. There is a kind of woman most of us have known, or bin. The woman who learned early that her job was to make things run, to keep the household steady, the children fed, the silences manageable, to fold herself into whatever shape the life around her required, and to do it so quietly and so well that nobody thought to ask whether the shape fit. She cooked in kitchens that weren't hers. She kept peace in rooms where the peace cost her something. She buried the strongest parts of herself deep enough that nobody would feel the need to argue with them. And somewhere along the way, she stopped sitting at the head of the table, not because anyone took the chair from her, because she forgot it was ever an option. The people who loved us most were not always the ones who loved us well. Sometimes they were afraid of losing us, of losing themselves, of the particular loneliness of standing against the people they had always stood with. And their fear left marks on us that took years to name. But here is what the river knows, and what it has always known. It does not ask who you were before you arrived. It does not ask what you carried or how long. It only moves. And in moving, it carries away what you are finally willing to release. You have been strong for a long time, maybe long enough. If any part of this story felt familiar, leave a comment below. Sometimes the most useful thing is simply knowing you are not the only one who has ever stood at the edge of their own life, wondering when it gets to be theirs. The river at Heron's Bend does not know Maggie Holloway's name, but on that morning, sitting in a chair that had never been hers and was now entirely hers, looking out at the water that had watched everything and remembered everything and said nothing, she thought perhaps the river didn't need to know her name. It only needed her to be there. And she was.